Welcome to the First Church in Jamaica Plain, Unitarian Universalist. I've been a member here. I'm George Wardle. I've been a member here since 1985, and since 1992, I've been the church historian. I'd like first for us, we're going to do the land acknowledgement that we do here every Sunday. You are on Massachusetts land. This land has been stewarded for generations by the Massachusetts people. First Church's Puritan ancestors are responsible for the theft of these lands and for cultural and physical violence against indigenous people and people of African ancestry. This church was also financially supported by merchants profiting from enslavement and slavery-produced commodities. Our community is beginning the work of reparation for this history. We are not yet sure what that work will entail, but we can begin by learning and telling our real history. We invite you to bring your open heart, your ideas, and your commitment into this work. Today, we welcome you for a presentation on slavery in Jamaica Plain from the group Hidden Jamaica Plain. Don't know my own strength. The Jamaica Plain Historical Society is a very important sponsor of our work, and their website will be where the information that we gather will be presented. The First Church in Jamaica Plain, Unitarian Universalist, is the physical host for you today. It brings the Jamaica Plain Historical Society back to where it started in this room in 1987. We also have many other sponsors of the event today. First Baptist Church in Jamaica Plain, Hidden Brookline, the Loring Greeno House, Roxbury Historical Society, St. John's Episcopal Church, and the Elliott School. A note on terminology. Terminology in this work is complicated, especially when describing race. Hidden Jamaica Plain tries to apply the terms people use to describe themselves during the historical eras we write about. In the 1600s and the 1700s, Black people used the term African in founding their institutions. So Hidden Jamaica Plain uses the term Africans for this period. White enslavers used the term Negro to describe Black people and often used the term mulatto or mulatto to describe people who they perceived to be of mixed races. When quoting historical documents, we present the original word in quotation marks. Indigenous people in the 1600s and 1700s identified themselves by their local, tribal, and place names, such as the Massachusetts, the people of the Great Hills. Where known, we use those names. Where unknown, we use the term indigenous. In quoting original documents, we present the word Indian used by white colonists in quotation marks. Hidden Jamaica Plain capitalizes the terms Black, white, and indigenous. We anticipate that preferred terminology may change in years to come. Jamaica Plain. Jamaica Plain is now a neighborhood of Boston, but was formerly part of Roxbury, which was a separate town. Jamaica Plain has never been its own municipality. In 1630, Roxbury stretched from the Boston Neck to Dedham. All colonial residents were required to support the first parish in Roxbury Church, which was formed in 1631. In 1712, Roxbury divided into two parishes, with the western portion forming the second parish of Roxbury. 1772, the third parish in Roxbury, formed on the Pond Plain, carved out of the two existing parishes to form a church on this very site where we sit today. Today, we call it the First Church in Jamaica Plain. It was originally the meeting house for the third parish in Roxbury. In 1851, a new town was created called West Roxbury. It included Jamaica Plain. West Roxbury seceded from the city of Roxbury in 1851. In 1873, the town of West Roxbury, including Jamaica Plain, was annexed by the city of Boston. The convener of the Hidden JP group is Mimi Peachy, who will take it from here. I shouldn't.
You may be wondering how Hidden Jamaica Plain got started. We were inspired because next door, the Brookline Department of Diversity and Inclusion, through Hidden Brookline, and Barbara Brown is here today, had researched slavery and freedom and offered tours. And I went on one of Barbara's tours, which are offered through the Brookline Adult Ed program, and I would highly recommend that you would consider, if you're interested in this topic, you consider doing so. In touring with Barbara, I had an aha moment when she showed us this map. This is slave owners' property in Brookline in 1746. And as you can see, the blue area is property of people who enslaved others to farm that land. And I was gobsmacked by this because I'd known that there was some slavery in New England, some slavery in the North, but I had no idea that it was this extensive. So I started, of course, that started the wheels turning, and I started thinking, well, if it's happening next door in Brookline, what's happening on the other side of the Muddy Brook in Jamaica Plain? So I came back and started talking to the Historical Society. We got together and started talking and decided we wanted to do some more research. And we started to pull together other people. We contacted groups from Lauren Greenham House, Elliott School, and the First Church in Jamaica Plain, and asked what they were doing. It turned out that all of these groups were starting to do their own research. So we decided collectively to come together and work to put together this research. And over the last 2 years, the First Baptist Church and community activists and people from the academic community have joined us. We are delighted to have two wonderful advisors, Crystal Rollins Jackson, who is the president of Beacon Hill Scholars, and Byron Rushing, our former state senator. This is a 100% volunteer effort. And if these topics interest you, we invite you to join us. Oops. Our goals are a little bit more widespread than just slavery. We want to understand the history of indigenous people who lived in reciprocity with the land we call Jamaica Plain, and how Europeans claimed that land for private use and extraction. We are identifying enslaved people and enslavers from the 1600s and 1700s in Jamaica Plain, and we are trying to develop a picture of their lives, as well as the economic system and societal institutions that supported slavery in New England. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but we would appreciate it, some help in coming to help us find this history, is to develop the history of the abolitionism in Jamaica Plain. And we want to continue our research into the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries to talk about the movements and activities of Black, Indigenous, and people of color that made a difference and an impact in our Jamaica Plain community and beyond. As we do all of this, we will be coordinating with neighboring communities to share awareness and knowledge. I'd like to introduce Ann Gilmore, who has been conducting our research on indigenous people in Jamaica Plain.
Thank you, Mimi. I just want to say that this work is so near and dear to my heart. For the last 40 years, through marriage and motherhood, I have been blessed to be part of an extended Afro-Indigenous Mashpee Wampanoag family who have struggled to protect their people and homeland from insatiable development efforts, and even a recent effort by the federal government in 2020 to terminate what little is left of their once 14,000-acre reservation. I dedicate this work to that family. This place we know as Jamaica Plain was the homeland of the indigenous Massachusetts people for thousands of years before the English colonizers arrived in 1630. They lived in close relationship and balance with the abundant diversity of life. The lands and waters were shared by the community with no concept of private ownership or commodification of land or of people. Well-maintained trails connected them with other Massachusetts villages and with larger kinship and trade networks throughout the region, including with the Nipmuc people to the west and the Wampanoags, Narragansett, and Pequots to the south. All of the indigenous people of Massachusetts and New England spoke regional dialects of a common language known as Algonquin. In 2022, just across the street from the front of this church, at the Loring Greenough House, Boston archaeologists found evidence of an indigenous site, including pre-colonial pottery and flakes from stone tool making. The stone flakes were of two distinct types. Some were a unique form of rhyolite, mined for thousands of years by the Massachusetts people from their quarry in Mattapan, highly valued for its bands of maroon color. But most of the stone flakes discovered were of quartzite, a stone found and used by the Nipmucs in central Massachusetts, indicating that the site may have been a trading center between the Massachusetts and the Nipmuc people. The location of this site here in Monument Square at the confluence of Center and South Streets was no surprise to head archaeologist Joe Bagley, who explained that these roads were, quote, almost certainly originally native trails going both east and west of the Jamaica Pond area. The European religious and secular rulers, beginning with popes in the 1400s, asserted that as Christians, they were superior to all others and claimed a divine right to conquer, colonize, take the land of, and enslave non-Christian people, who were referred to as heathens or savages. This doctrine of discovery was eventually validated by the US Supreme Court in the 1800s to justify ongoing land theft. And it's still relied on in US courts in the 21st century. Based on this doctrine, European explorers were sent to map indigenous lands for conquest. The land in New England was mapped by the English for conquest in 1614 on an expedition led by Captain John Smith. In 1629, King Charles I signed a charter granting all of the land around the Massachusetts Bay to a group of wealthy Puritan investors. The investors recruited thousands of prosperous Puritans and their servants and mercenaries to invade, seize, and settle on this land they had never seen or set foot upon, land that was the homeland of the Massachusetts people. English explorers and traders began enslaving indigenous people in New England in the 1500s. And then during Captain Smith's 1614 mapping expedition, 27 Wampanoag men were kidnapped and sold into the European slave market. In the 1630s, the English colonists in Massachusetts adopted slavery alongside land theft as a way to build their colonies and accumulate wealth. They launched a genocidal war in 1637 against the Pequots in Connecticut to gain control over their land and trade. The graphic on this slide was published in 1638 by Captain John Underhill of the Mass Bay Colony. It shows the calculated military strategy of a pre-dawn attack on a fortified Pequot village, encircling, setting fire to, and massacring 500 Pequots within an hour, mostly women, children, and elders with no means of escape. After the war, Captain Underhill was rewarded with a land grant north of Jamaica Pond. Later in the war, the colonists explicitly added the taking of captives as one of their goals. Hundreds of captured Pequots, mostly non-combatant women and children, were enslaved by political, religious, and military leaders in New England. Locally in Mass Bay, including Governor John Winthrop, Reverend Thomas Weld of First Church in Roxbury, and his brother, Captain Joseph Weld, who not only enslaved a Pequot, but was also given a large tract of land in Jamaica Plain as a result of his service. In the war's aftermath, Boston's African slave trade was launched. When 2 captive Pequot women and 15 boys were taken on the vessel Desire from Boston to be sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The ship returned in 1638 with the first recorded arrival of enslaved Africans brought from the Caribbean to be sold in Boston. During the Indigenous War of Resistance in 1675 to 1676, known as King Philip's War, about 2,000 Indigenous men, women, and children were enslaved. Many were sold in Bermuda and the Caribbean. During the late 1600s and through at least the 1700s, the colonists imposed multiple forms of involuntary servitude upon so-called free indigenous people. They could be coerced into military service or forced to indenture their children to English families. Servitude for a fixed or indefinite term was imposed by the colonial courts for debts, disputes with colonists, accusations of crime, and other reasons invented by the courts. It is important to remember that despite the colonists' many destructive actions, including attempts to assimilate and erase them, most of the southern New England indigenous nations have survived as vibrant and organized tribes or communities, including the Wampanoags, the Nipmucs, the Massachusetts, the Narragansett, and the Pequots. And now we will hear more from Mimi.
So who were the people in Jamaica Plain who enslaved others? The 1771 tax records for Roxbury show that nearly 11% of the people of the town of Roxbury were owners of servants for life. Okay, I'll speak. Okay, I'll tip it this way. So nearly 11% were owners of servants for life, and servants for life is a euphemism for enslaved people. Boston townhouses were typically where people were enslaved, and they also were enslaved at the Roxbury country estates. In the 1700s, there was a ring of large homes, country estates surrounding Jamaica Pond, and many of those homes had enslaved people. Up until the Revolution, they were loyalists like Joshua Loring of the Loring Greenough House. But it also included Revolutionary War patriots, including David Stoddard Greenough and Pondside resident John Hancock. It included church leaders such as Eleazar Weld, who is the ancestor of our previous governor, John Morey, who gave this clock to the church. Leaders of Harvard, Brown, and other institutions. But it wasn't just the wealthy. Regular people who were farmers, craftsmen, ministers, widows, lawyers, selectmen were also enslaving people. And the industries in which they were typically being employed were usually the dirtiest and hardest labor, including seafaring, shipbuilding, distilling, hide tanning. There are many more examples from all sectors of society. Did I miss it? I jumped a slide. Oh, how widespread, I think that's the one I missed. How widespread was slavery in Boston? Sorry about that. Boston Archaeology has a wonderful exhibit at Faneuil Hall. If you haven't visited it yet, I would encourage you to do so. They show that 12% of Boston's population were enslaved in the 1720s, and 25% of Boston households, 1 in 4, enslaved people. Most enslaver households had 1 to 2 enslaved people, and this was different from the slavery in the South. That's the key difference. And as we've discussed, it included people were involved in household service, unskilled and skilled craft work. This is sort of an interesting graphic. You can see the circle there. There was the red building was the home of the Apthorpe family, and the Apthorpes enslaved Caesar, Will, Scipio, Ben, and Mimbo. And it is quite likely, you can see this is an early painting of Boston, showing an African man pushing a cart on the left. It's encircled. Oh, sorry. This is it. So how did slavery end in Massachusetts? The key reason is from the efforts of enslaved people themselves. Enslaved people filed numerous petitions to the Massachusetts legislature. They filed many lawsuits. Finally, in 1783, a series of court cases, including those of Elizabeth Freeman, Mumbet, and Walk Walker, established a legal basis for emancipation. However, there was no great emancipation proclamation. Nobody went out and said to people, "You're free now." But what it did mean was that enslaved individuals could leave or sue, and the law would be on their side. So after 1783, enslavers escalated to indenturing poor and orphaned African, white, and indigenous children, forcing them to provide unpaid labor until 18 for girls and 21 for boys. We discovered in Jamaica Plain the names and indications of at least 27 people who were enslaved in our neighborhood in the 1700s. And I would like to share their names. Negro boy, name once known. Phyllis Lewis, Jack, London, Othello, Phyllis, Cato, Negro coachman, name once known. Prince, Cato, a Negro girl, name once known. Zipra, Vina, Leith, Cato, Frank, Agnes, Violet, Hannibal, 3 people, names once known. Sarah, enslaved person, name once known. Dick Maury Welsh and Musa Diaha. We also discovered in Jamaica Plain at least 6 people who were indentured in the 1700s. A slave trader who later turned to opium smuggling into China and lived in Jamaica Plain in the early 1800s. And as I mentioned, successive families at the Loring Greenough House who enslaved and indentured people. As we previously mentioned, some of the founders of First Church in Jamaica Plain were enslavers, but we also found that the First Church of Jamaica Plain death records from the early 1800s included free Black Americans. And we have researched those, and here to tell you more about them are George, Nancy, and Athalia. Wait. Sorry, I screwed up. I have to tell you about the freedom seekers. There's way more. We have discovered quite a bit of information about people who were seeking freedom. As our advisor, Byron Rushing often says, the only time the enslavers told the truth was when they were advertising to get the enslaved people to try to find them when they ran away. So we are recognizing today Prince, Leith, Sarah, and Dick Maury Welsh. And I will tell you some of these stories a little more in depth. The question of slavery versus indenture often comes up, and people want to know what's the difference. There are some racial differences in that indentured people were not, whites were generally indentured and not enslaved. But Africans and indigenous could be either indentured or enslaved. The most important, of course, is the issue of status. People were property if they were enslaved. That means that they could be bought and sold. There was no contract. It was for life. Any children that they have were also enslaved for life. In New England, differently from in the South, some enslaved people were taught to read and write. And of course, they were taught limited skills that benefited the enslaver. Any clothing that they had belonged to the enslaver. So when you look at those ads of runaways, they're often talking about the clothing. And there's really 2 reasons for that. One is, of course, that's that during a pre-industrial age, most people didn't have much clothing. So this was one of the ways that they could be identified. But the other piece is that that was property as well of the enslaver. As far as indentured, the difference is that they were working with limited freedom during their indenture, but they were freed at the end of their indenture. Usually it involved a contract, and in the 1700s, the average age was 10 for children, 10 years for, not average age, the average duration was 10 years. For girls, their indenture ended at age 18, and for boys at 21. Indenture was also used for adults to pay off debts. And for children, that once a parent's indenture ended, children were free as well. Indenture contracts usually required people who were indenturing to teach the indentured person to read or write, and taught them skills that would hopefully help them in later life. After the indenture, the clothing belonged to an indentured person after the contract ended. But let me talk a little bit about Prince. Prince was enslaved. He's described as 18 years of age, 5 feet high, well-built, except small legs, talks good English. One of his upper foreteeth broke nigh halfway up to his gum. It also describes him as having a large scar on his belly, occasioned by a scald. It makes you wonder how Prince got that scar on his belly as a little child, probably handling hot liquids. Did he receive any medical or assistance? One wonders. This ad was placed 3 times over 2 months. And the question we have is, did Prince's escape succeed? Prince was enslaved by Eleazar Weld, one of the founders of this church. Dick Morey Welsh. Dick was enslaved at birth to John Morey, who gave that cloth to this church. At age 5, Morey had other plans. His wife inherited some property and outside of Jamaica Plain, and he decided to move. And he sold his property and his physical property, the land, but he also sold Dick Morey Welsh to David Stoddard Greeno. And there is an actual bill of sale that is available that you can see online at the Massachusetts Historical Society. The next year, that was in 1785. The next year in 1786, remember we talked a little bit about how enslavers turned to indenturing. This is an example that because he was a lawyer, Greeno was uncomfortable about having this bill of sale. So he turned, and even though it says indentured in the bill of sale, it's clearly a bill of sale. He decided to instead put together an indenture. And this is, as you can see, a formal indenture written on a pre-printed form. And he's indenturing at this point in 1786, Dick Morey for the next few years to age 21. Interestingly, this was not an agreement that Dick was keen on, apparently, because he ran away at age 18. And you can see the ad in the bottom of Greeno's ad looking for Dick. He sought his freedom at age 18 in 1798. And the question is, did Dick's escape succeed? And I'm sorry to say we don't think so. We believe, given the fact that we looked in the 1800 census and the 1810 census, we believe that Dick had come back to live in the Greeno house and finish out his indenture, but that by 1810 he was free. This is a slightly different story. This is about a woman who was imprisoned in Jamaica Plain. We don't know exactly where she was, but she, according to a petition that she filed with the Massachusetts courts, said that she was being detained in a house in Jamaica Plain. She was a woman of about 25 years of age. She was a Negro woman taken on the high seas, is how she was described in her petition. This was during the American Revolutionary War in 1777. And she was a passenger on a British packet boat, the Weymouth, bound from Jamaica to London. And that was seized by a Connecticut Navy ship called the Oliver Cromwell. And what they did was they brought all the passengers to Boston, and they worked out a prisoner exchange with American prisoners in England, in New York, in return for the British passengers who were on this packet boat. Everybody except for Cooper. She was brought to Boston and detained in a house in Jamaica Plain, and she was kept from sleeping or speaking to visitors. The Weymouth was determined to be a vessel of war, and that meant that the crew could sell the Oliver Cromwell. And they made it very clear that they were intending to sell her back into slavery. So she petitioned, and we don't know the answer as to who it was who helped her, because we know she was illiterate from the way she signed the petition with an X, but we know that she got help. And she petitioned based on a 1776 ruling of a Massachusetts maritime court, which prevented people who had been enslaved or from being sold back into slavery. And so she did win her freedom. We have not yet been able to find anything out more about where Kupa went after she was freed, but I would reckon that she did not stay around Jamaica Plain. So on to telling you a little bit more about William Gordon.
Reverend William Gordon was the first minister of the third parish of Roxbury, this church. He had come to America in support of the American Revolution. He was an Englishman who supported the causes of the American Revolution. In 1777, in a letter to a Boston newspaper, the Independent Chronicle, he put in a letter asking that he would hope that you are the sons of liberty and wish you therefore to be consistent and never move to admit the sale of Negroes to be advertised in your papers. It is hoped by an act of the state to put a final stop to the sale of them, which may be of some help towards eradicating slavery from among us. Later on, he was a guest at Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington. Throughout the war, he had corresponded with George Washington. He was also at the time preparing a history of the American Revolution, which he does go on to write. But during that visit, he overheard conversations between Lafayette and George Washington, who were both discussing how to get rid of slavery. And he wrote a follow-up letter kind of saying, I support gradual abolition. I am not for letting all those loose upon the public, but for gradually releasing them and their posterity from bonds. In our church records, in the book of our second minister, Thomas Gray, who was here as minister for 50 years, he does a very careful job of listing all of the deaths in Jamaica Plain. He and his assistant, George Whitney, did that listing. There were over 450. So that's far more people than were ever buried in the graveyard here. So it was the deaths throughout Jamaica Plain. Amongst those, we found these people who were identified by race in those records. Peter Bridgham, a Negro age 87 who dies of old age. Othello Cutler, a Negro age 45 of dropsy. Phoebe Giles, a Black, age 71 of bilious colic. David Brigham, a Black man, age 33 of cholera morbus. Hannah Brigham, a Black, age 50 of inflammation of the windpipe. Hannah Thomas, a Black, age 22 of lung fever. Joseph, son of Simeon Giles, age 13 of typhus fever. Simon Bridgham, a colored man, age 80 of old age. So we are interested in finding out about those people of color that were here in the 1800s after slavery. First, the group of us from First Church are working on these records. And we want to give a special thank you to Catherine Sassanov for being our instructor on how to pursue this work, guiding us through it and continuing to support us in that. And to continue with this information, I'd like to introduce Nancy Amatafar from the First Church group.
Mention that Catherine Sasanoff is here with us today. Raise your hand. Early in our search of First Church history for this project, we learned that the original First Church building had a separate place in the back loft for people of color. And as you saw in the previous slide, we also found the death records for 8 people of color in the early 19th century church records. We wanted to learn as much as we could about the lives of those named individuals. The person I chose to start with was Peter Bridgham, who died in 1801, as you saw, of old age. Here's what we've gleaned so far and what questions have surfaced. Peter Bridgham was born around 1714. We don't yet know how he acquired the last name Bridgham, but we suspect the white Bridghams who came to Boston in the 1600s had some connection. Probate records indicate that they were enslavers. Peter Bridgham was enslaved by Colonel William Dudley, the son of Governor Joseph Dudley. Peter was a laborer working the land of Colonel Dudley in Roxbury. While enslaved, Peter married Betty Crummell in 1741, and they had 3 children of record, Phoebe, Peter, and Simon. After Colonel William Dudley died, Peter was eventually sold in 1750, but we don't yet know to whom. What is of particular interest is that Peter Bridgham was a free man by 1774. How he obtained his freedom is another piece of the puzzle we will research. However, we know he was a free man because he purchased a 1/4 acre of land in Roxbury from the John Morey family, who you've heard about already. The property was along the county road to Dedham, or Center Street as we know it today. By 1790, Peter Bridgham is listed in the federal census as living in a household of 5 people. And you can see on the slide a copy of the census of 1790. Peter Bridgham's house and land were listed as having a value of $140 in the 1798 tax records. In 1799, Peter made a will, which I'll share with you momentarily. Peter died 2 years later. We know a little bit about his daughter Phoebe and his son Simon. Phoebe married a man whose last name was Boston. It appears that Simon was married twice, or possibly 3 times. The earliest records show that Simon Bridgham and Sally Sheldon posted their marriage intentions at North Church in Boston, an Episcopal church. Unlike other vital records of the time, there was no mention of them being Black. There's no record of their actual marriage, only their intention. Simon later married Judah Eady in the late 1790s and Hannah Rowe in 1804. You can see their marriage intentions with the record on the slide as well. Simon showed up in the 1810 and 1830 federal census as head of household. He died of old age in 1837. Now I turn to his Peter's will, which I will read. In the name of God, Amen. I, Peter Bridgham of Roxbury, in the county of Norfolk and state of Massachusetts, laborer, being advanced in years, but of sound disposing mind and memory, blessed be Almighty God for the same, do make and ordain this to be my last will and testament. First, I give to my son Simon Bridgham the sum of $50, $10 of it to be paid yearly until the whole shall be paid.
Secondly, all the residue and remainder of my estate, real and personal, I give to and devise to my daughter Phoebe Boston, her heirs and assigns to her and their use forever. But I order that she and they permit the said Simon, during his natural life in his own proper person, to occupy 1/2 of my mansion house in Roxbury. But this shall not authorize him to permit any person or persons to occupy the same half, as I mean it to be a personal privilege to himself. But in case he should claim any debts against my estate, then I revoke all that I have bequeathed to him, except $1, which I give him. Lastly, I appoint the said Phoebe sole executrix of this last my will, and do revoke all former wills by me made, in witness whereof I, the said Peter, have hereto set my hand and seal this 24th day of December A.D. 1799. He signs, Peter Bridgham, with an X, and his will is signed by 3 individuals as witnesses: John Davis, Stephen Payson, James Hunting. Now call up Thalia McMillian, and you'll hear about another family. Oh, thank you. Advanced it for me. Hi, I'm Thalia. Hi, I'm Thalia McMillian, and I again want to thank Catherine Sasnoff, who spent many hours with me researching for Simeon Giles. Today I have the privilege of speaking about Simeon Giles, who was a free Black man born around 1780, and he lived until 1858. Simeon was a landowner, a homeowner, a farmer and a laborer who spent much of his life in Jamaica Plain, which at that time was part of Roxbury. Official records offer some circumstantial evidence about 2 Black women that were very likely related to him. The first is Phoebe Giles, who died at age 71 in 1818, and she was most likely his mother. And Dinah Giles was probably his grandmother. She died in 1801 in a workhouse, and she was 80 years old. So it's possible also that Simeon's father was a Peter Giles, who was said to have worked as a servant for Governor Samuel Adams when he lived in Jamaica Plain. And he lived at the site of the former Peacock Tavern on the current Allendale Road. So it was over near the Faulkner Hospital. In 1821, Simeon married Hannah Robbins at First Parish Church in Dedham. Hannah was the daughter of a blacksmith named Joseph Robbins and his wife Venice, often called Venus, Thatcher of Milton, and Hannah was the oldest of 6 children. In 1822, Hannah gave birth to Joseph, who was probably named for her father. And in 1832, 10 years later, Simeon and Hannah had a daughter. Somebody telling me to be louder? Sorry? Oh, okay, good. And Simeon and Hannah had a daughter named Phoebe Ann, probably named for Simeon's mother. Less than a year later, though, tragedy struck the family. In February of 1833, Hannah was walking home from her parents' house in Dedham to her own home through the woods in Jamaica Plain. Her husband and her parents, she disappeared, and her husband and her parents ran multiple ads trying to find her in the newspapers. And they described her clothing, which was a small silk hood, a check plaid coat with a small cape, a blue calico gown, and a cashmere shawl. And the fact that she had previously shown symptoms of a deranged mind. So it makes you wonder if she maybe was suffering from postpartum or don't know why she got lost going home. But about 1 month later, in March of 1833, Hannah's body was discovered in the woods, and it was supposed that she perished from cold and fatigue. So it appears that the infant, Phoebe, went to live with her loving grandparents in Dedham, and Simeon and Joseph continued their lives in Jamaica Plain. But sadly, 2 years later, Joseph died at age 13 of typhus fever. And Simeon's name appears in our church records, which was then the third parish of Roxbury. Simeon's name appears as Joseph's father. And since Phoebe Giles and Dinah Giles were also buried through the third parish, it's very, very likely that they were all related. In 1839, Simeon purchased 2 pieces of land with the buildings thereon, bound on 2 of its sides by Burroughs and Center Street in the area around Elliott Hall. So it's right on the street where we're sitting today. But on a map dated 1852, it appears he also owned a home that can be clearly seen near the intersection of Center and May Street. And this is likely the property that Simeon later leaves to his daughter in his will. In 1849, Phoebe Ann Giles married Thomas F. Bancroft, a bootmaker who was a member of the Ponkapock tribe in Canton, and they lived in Canton together until at least 1860. And according to the 1850 census, Simeon Giles was the head of a household, and another family was living with him. John Bancroft, John's wife, Hannah Harrison Bancroft, and their 3 children, John Henry, Mary Elizabeth, and Stephen. John Bancroft was the uncle of Thomas, who was married to Simeon's daughter, Phoebe. In the 1855 census, the Bancroft family is still living with Simeon Giles, but the only child listed was their middle child, Mary Elizabeth, who was 15 at the time. Very disturbingly, in 1856, a white neighbor, Henry Sweetser, walked in on a drunken John Bancroft beating his wife. He intervened, and in a rage at Sweetser, John grabbed an iron bar and inflicted a mortal wound. So he had a court trial, claimed self-defense, but he was convicted of manslaughter and was sentenced to 20 years in Charlestown prison, and he died there 3 years later in 1859. Perhaps because of the violence that happened in his own home, Simeon Giles that year prepared his own will. That was 1856, and he left everything to his daughter, Phoebe Ann. Simeon's assets included land and a dwelling house worth $500, banknotes, and $1,008.35 in the bank. He made it very clear in his will that all of the assets were for, quote, the sole use of Phoebe Ann, independent of her husband, Thomas F. Bancroft, during her lifetime, unquote. Paid out in installments, the money gave Phoebe Ann a cushion of support and may have allowed her not to be trapped in an unhappy marriage. Simeon Giles died 2 years later in 1858 at age 77. A couple of interesting facts about Bancroft family. According to military records, John Henry Bancroft, who was one of the children that lived with Simeon Giles, fought in the Civil War. He served in the Massachusetts 54th Infantry, which is the famed Black regiment that inspired the movie Glory. John Henry died a hero at Fort Wagner in 1863. Phoebe's husband Thomas also served in the Civil War in Company B of the Massachusetts 5th Cavalry. But also in 1863, John Bancroft's widow, John Henry's mother, Hannah Harrison Bancroft, married Jeremiah Bancroft, the nephew of her late husband. Try to keep this straight. And then the brother of Thomas. He was also the brother of Thomas, who was Phoebe's husband. There's even more intertwining in that. But these 4 families, the Giles, the Robbins, the Harrisons, and the Bancrofts, were all very closely intertwined through their marriages. And it gets a little confusing. So I actually made a poster with some of their family units that are back on the table that you can look at afterwards if you're interested, that shows the relationships between some of these families. They all lived not so far from each other, and obviously they're very connected. Simeon's daughter, Phoebe Ann, was a retired seamstress, and she lived quite a long time. She died in Dedham in 1908 at age 76. Although she was listed as a widow on her death certificate, she and her husband, Thomas, were living separately as they had for many years. Phoebe lived in Boston and then in Dedham, and Thomas remained in Canton. And there's no evidence that they ever had any children. There's a marker in the Arnold Arboretum at the site of a homestead that was identified as belonging to Simeon Giles. A photo of the site is on the slide. It should be noted that this location appears to be different from the property that he left to his daughter in his will, but we're still investigating all of that and trying to find the answers. Jamaica Plain author Harriet Manning Whitcomb in 1897 suggests that Simeon Giles is buried next to Peter Giles, who may have been his father, on the Little Hill, and we think the Little Hill is the Walter Hill burying ground. So there's not enough time this afternoon to share everything that we've discovered about Simeon Giles and the families that were related to Simeon, and there's many, many questions to still be answered. Where was he born, and was he or his parents enslaved? Where else did he live besides Jamaica Plain? We need to learn more about his first 40 years. The first that we know about was when he got married at age 40 in 1821. So there's a whole life we're still trying to find out about. Where is he buried? So I just want to say that researching the life of Simeon Giles has been a fascinating journey. Just feeling like I almost know him now. And I look forward to discovering more details about a very, very interesting man. Thank you.
It helps if you hold it in the right direction. There we go. So where do we go from here as Hidden Jamaica Plain? We are publishing research and sharing it widely. Jamaica Plain Historical Society has been fantastic in putting our several articles up on the website. They're newly up, and I would encourage you to go and look at them. In addition, we printed out a few copies that are there may be still a few copies back available on the table in the back. We are intending to create an online walking tour that will be under the auspices of the JP Historical Society. And we'll also be presenting more programs like this in the community. As I mentioned, we are trying to cover 5 centuries of history, and so we are going to be continuing our research into abolition, the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. We'll also, where possible, try to locate descendants of enslaved people we've researched to share what we've found. And we will consider what reparative justice might look like by studying what other communities have done, markers, memorials, art, and other ways to improve the outcomes for communities still harmed by the impact of slavery. So thank you very much to our sponsors. Thank you everybody here and online for attending. We invite you to join us, and we invite you to ask us lots of questions. Yeah, okay. All right, this is the picture.
Someone want to ask a question?
Yes, could someone talk a little more about one of the earlier ladies that we talked about, Hula?
Yes.
Her name was, do you know the group of people? She apparently was educated. Did she speak English? Did she have a sponsor? How did she petition for her freedom?
Okay, the question was to explain a little bit more about what we know about Cuba, the woman who petitioned for her freedom in 1777. Basically, all we have is that one document from, that is at Massachusetts State Archives, that is the petition. She signs her name with an X, so we really do not believe that she was literate. We believe that someone else must have been helping her to write that petition. There's further research to be done in terms of looking up court records and filings and going other routes to see if we can ferret out more as to who might have been helping her. But at this point, we don't know. We actually don't even know whether she was enslaved to start with. She may have been traveling from Jamaica to London as a free Black woman. We don't know. Most of the other information we have, we found in the annals, the naval annals of the American Revolution, volumes 9 and 10. That's where we got most of the other information sort of surrounding the case. That helped us to write the article. But there's on all of these, there is scant resources, and a lot of this is just pure dumb luck. If you're looking in an area and you happen to see something and are able to connect it.
Was she African? Do you know if she was African, and do you happen to know what?
We have only the description of Negro to go by. But because the crew perceived her as Negro, they felt that they had the right to sell her back into slavery. The way that it worked during the American Revolution was that if a British ship was seized, the crew and the captain and the owners of the ship had right to, I think, a third of the property. However, if it was called a vessel of war, which is why it was important for them to get that characterized like that, they got 50%. And in this petition, the person who was the acting captain apparently made some extremely racist, if you read the actual petition, they're very, very racist comments about Black people and his belief about them, his beliefs, and was quite clear apparently in his intention to sell Cuba back into slavery in Jamaica.
Thank you.
Comments. I noticed with the indenture.
Is this not on?
I noticed with the indenture of was it a 6-year-old or 10-year-old, or probably not good with names. And I noticed that the indenture didn't have the typical cuttings on the top to be matched up with another one. So I thought that was kind of the ambivalent that it said it was an indenture, but it didn't have the cuttings on the top that would be matched with another, and the person whose indenture matches is that what they want. So I thought that was interesting. It's one other thing. I looked at a number of the Boston overseers before indentures, and have noticed that typically men were taught to read and write, and women were only taught to read. So if someone was able to read but not able to write, so someone, I don't know, technically illiterate, I think, can refer to somebody who neither reads nor writes. And excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. For the people at home, I'll repeat the question or comment really. The first point was about the Dick Morey indenture and how it's missing, how it's missing a piece of apparently along the top. Now, this is something I'm unfamiliar with, and maybe you and I can speak about that later, and you'll educate me on something I didn't know. But the material that we have is from the Massachusetts Historical Society, and it's from online. So it is possible that maybe some piece of it didn't get photographed. And as far as the Boston Overseers for the Poor, who took care of a lot of the indentures, they were responsible for indenturing to numbers of the children into households in Jamaica Plain and elsewhere in Boston. The comment was that this person has viewed a lot of these records, and that more typically men were, male indentures were taught to read and write, whereas females were only taught to read. We have found Eleazar Weld indentured someone named Elizabeth Patton, and looking at her indenture, she was taught to read and write. So I think that perhaps varied based on who was enslaving, or not indenturing the person.
But I just want to comment, in the readings about Dick Morey, it's clear that it was quite on Dick Morey. David Stoddard Greeno took a standardized form and crossed out the sections for the parents or the person to accept that and sign for that. He just crossed those out and said, this is the indenture and you're stuck.
Thank you, and thank you so much. It was an incredible presentation, and I'm really touched by the full house today, and at one point, 136 people online, so really. My question is to the entire group of presenters, and that is, this incredible research that you've done as volunteers, how has it affected you personally? You shared an enormous amount of facts with us, and I'm wondering about impact.
Well, and I think Thalia indicated how she had certainly been affected by her research into Simeon Giles. All of us have, I think, gone on an incredible journey by doing this research. The question was how we as researchers been affected by this 2-year journey that we've taken. We've had some very, very deep discussions about race and how everything that we presented has been, we have had a lot of discussion about how we presented, the terminology we use, the descriptions, even the focus. It would be very, very easy for us to put together an article on the enslavers of Jamaica Plain. There's lots of information about that. The white men, primarily, who were doing that enslaving, were pillars of the community. They were all over. There's lots of literature about them. We have pictures of them. But for the people who were enslaved, there are these scant little details that we're able to pick up from the enslaved, the runaway ads, and from other mentions here and there. And I think all of us changed to thinking about it from the perspective of somebody who was enslaved, and what we owed them to tell those stories and share those stories. Does anybody else want to speak to that?
I just wanted to say that I think in researching Simeon Giles, who happened to be free, but I'm sure he probably had relatives that were not, you read all of these things and they're so heartbreaking, many of them, especially his wife. Losing his wife and then his son and his daughter living somewhere else. But sometimes you think you're walking the same streets they did, and you report on it, and it's different than what you feel inside, because when you're thinking about them afterwards, they were real people. And I think what we're trying to do is make them more real by finding out more about them. So we want to continue. There's so much more to learn.
Could you talk, before you leave, could
Yeah.
you talk a little bit more, if you know, about Simeon and how he, not sure how to characterize it, how he escaped from being unscathed free?
How Simeon managed to remain free and how,
How he came about, you know,
Right.
to this country as a free man, and how he.
well, we don't really know, because the only way we know when he was born was subtracting that he was 77 when he died in 1858. So he was born in either 1780 or 1781. But we're all still looking for some documentation of the early years. We don't know that he was born in Boston. But if his father was really Peter Giles and lived out near the Arboretum, where Samuel Adams' estate was, they might have been enslaved by the people before Samuel Adams bought it, and that was in 1794, I think. So we don't really know the answer to that, but I think he remained free. He by every indication, he was a very hardworking man, and he cared about his family, and he purchased property, which I think he sold some and then bought others. So I think he just worked really hard. I found nothing derogatory about him at all when I was reading it. But I think he was born in 1780, so he might not have been enslaved himself unless he was a child. So we don't really know his first 40 years.
I'd like to report on how Thalia has been impacted as her husband. In the middle of the night, she would start talking. And quite frankly,
He hardly needs the microphone.
go ahead, okay. I don't need to shout quite that loud. But, quite frankly, it was even listening and then waking up and having breakfast. And she would not stop about the impact that everyone in this room brings to all of us this afternoon. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm working.
There's a whole flock of hands that go up, and I wanted to utilize that to be the next. So, you may.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent presentation. And I want to extend an invitation to a webinar coming up in April that this group might be interested in. And I'll tell you what it is, but I think I should send the information to your organization's URL, and then you can spread it as well. Just briefly, I'm a volunteer for the Doc C. Gracie Center for Human Reconciliation. And the purpose of the center, the mission, is the minor goal of ending racism and other forms of human oppression. But that's the goal. And we're having a webinar on April 17th from 7 to 9 o'clock, free. Everyone is invited to attend. The speaker will be a man named Rick Murphy, who's a historian and genealogist, a man of African descent, originally from Massachusetts. Some of you may have known him, who's written 5 books and 1 documentary. And the topic that he's chosen is the history of the first Africans from their arrival to the Revolutionary War, about which he's written a book, and about his documentary is about that as well. So I invite you all to register and I send the information to your organization.
Thank you. The comment was that there's going to be a presentation on April 17th, and information will be posted through Hidden Jamaica Plain and maybe the Jamaica Plain Historical Society.
It looks like there are some questions in the chat.
Oh, are we ready to take questions from the chat?
Once you get time, you should take one or two more from the floor and try to continue on close online.
Okay. So we are taking two more questions from the floor, and then we'll,
Yes, so can you tell us a bit about James Perkins? Because I don't think we should forget the power of slave traders who were located from Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Thank you. And whose house was above Jamaica Pond.
yes, people are probably familiar, some people, with, as you walk around Jamaica Pond, there is a set of stairs which has John Hancock's name on it. If you go up the top of those stairs, there is an outline for a house. That was the third Perkins home. The first Perkins home was built in 1802 by somebody named James Perkins. James Perkins was an enslaved, he was both an enslaver, but he also was very active in the slave trade in Haiti. The wealth that was used to build his 1802 home in Jamaica Plain was derived from going on board ships in San Domingue, in Haiti, and selecting people newly arrived from Africa to sell to, as a middleman, to sell to plantation owners in Jamaica. Not Jamaica, in Haiti. And he and his brothers, Thomas and Dacid, and Samuel, who have very large estates that were still, I believe those homes are still available for view in Brooklyn. Or one of them is. Yeah, yeah. Hidden Brooklyn, we have written an article on James Perkins. And it is on the Jamaica Plain Historical Society's website. And there's also an article on the Hidden Brookline website, which I would encourage you to look at. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to embroider that more, except for to tell you to go look there. We also have a very important article on Musa Diaha, who was enslaved by James Perkins of the Pond, and who probably, based on the information we have, was at the pond, based on the census information, and his story of how he came from Africa, was enslaved in Haiti, and then ended up serving the Perkins family for the rest of his life. So I'd encourage you to go look at those. And one more question. You have a last question?
You mentioned that slavery was outlawed. You mentioned that slavery was outlawed. I forgot the date, 16 or 17.
1783.
But it continued on for a couple of decades. And I wonder what were the circumstances under which people continued to live in slavery, even though it was no longer legal? Were they unaware that it was not legal? Were they social pressures so great?
I doubt that people, well, in some cases, people were unaware that in the 1783 series of cases meant that enslaved people were free. In some cases, they might not have heard, but eventually they must have heard. And your question was, why did it endure in Massachusetts beyond 1783? And some of that has to do, if you think about it, with where could people get a job? What were their options? In most cases, I mean, there was a free Black community on Beacon Hill. There were over 1,000 people, Black people, who lived on the north slope of Beacon Hill. And that community continued to grow in size through especially the 1800s. As more and more people were able to gain their freedom, but it wasn't an overnight kind of phenomenon. It was a more gradual phenomenon.
Can I just speak one thing to this? If you can see the New England Quarterly Journal, the most recent issue talks about, it's a family, I can't remember where they are in Massachusetts, if they're in Boston or they're up on the North Shore, they were loyalists. And what they did was, when they escaped to Halifax, they took the daughter of their enslaved woman and held her there. And they knew this enslaved woman wanted to leave. That it was a hostage situation. She would never see her daughter again if she made a move. So it's an extraordinary article about how she eventually gets there and gets hold of her daughter and that. But I never even thought of that, almost like an extortion, sort of thing. So I just wanted to mention that if anybody wanted to.
Thank you. Just for the people at home, that was a comment on from the New England, the most recent issue of New England Journal, about basically a kidnapping and extortion situation of people who were enslaved, by people who were enslavers. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time. I would like to ask, other people here who are part of Hidden Jamaica Plain who did not speak, I'd like to ask everybody to rise for our final applause. Well, thank you for coming, and we invite you to have whatever's left of the refreshments, and to please take a look at what's on the table if there's anything left, and if not, go to the Jamaica Plain Historical Society's website.